Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, in fact, we're just past 12. Could you, I think we nudge up to the welcome slide. Welcome to the third annual conference for the Coalition of Healthy Streets and Active Travel in Oxfordshire, CoHSAT. I'm Robin Tucker, one of the two co-chairs of CoHSAT, along with Simon Pratt. And the theme of our conference this year is planning healthy and inclusive places. We'll just give a couple of minutes for more people to arrive. And we are recording the event today. And I'd like to give a thank you right at the start here to Legacy Events for helping to organise the logistics for this. And a bit of housekeeping. Please, can you put yourselves on mute? Our team, Karen and Clarence from Legacy, will be helping to do that. We'll be having a Q&A session a bit later today. So questions, you can put it for that in the chat box as we'll go. Any technical issues you can send to Karen at Legacy Events if you have them along the way. And you can follow CoHSAT on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter, or you can visit CoHSAT, cohsat.org.uk. We've already put details of the projects we'll be talking about today on those sites, so you'll be able to look them up there. So I'd like to, 12:03 now, so I'd like to properly welcome you to the CoHSAT conference now. Planning and healthy inclusive places is our theme this year. We'll be telling you about three of our projects. Why did we pick that for our theme? Well, we know our current system for places and movement is broken in at least three ways. Climate change, I don't really need to explain. We've already used up one of our so-called 1.5 safe degrees, and the damages are piling up from storms, floods and wildfires. It's killing animals, people and entire ecosystems. Health is the second factor. Air pollution is bad, but actually physical inactivity is the biggest danger, a causal factor in 100,000 UK deaths every year. Last time we had that many deaths, we locked down our streets, but now we really need to open them up for people to walk, wheel and cycle. And the third is the problems of traffic itself. Even after swallowing up epic quantities of precious landscape and city under tarmac, car traffic grinds to a halt under its own mass, while somehow making the more efficient modes of cycling, walking and buses less attractive. So, and we can't think that electric vehicles will solve these problems. They are better in climate terms if they are manufactured and fueled with green electricity, but they will, because they're easier and cheaper to use, they will actually make the inactivity problem worse and the congestion problem worse. And DFT models predict more than 40% more vehicle traffic in the southeast over the next 30 years if we don't have a change of direction. And that's why we need a new paradigm for planning, one that enables and encourages healthy activity, not car dependency. And of course, with making this shift, it has to work for everyone, not just people with a fully functional set of limbs and senses. And that's what we'll explore today. In a moment, I'll be delighted to introduce our keynote speaker on the topic of inclusive active travel, and then three areas of planning and transport where we can apply these lessons. One is school travel, enabling healthy and active journeys at an age where behaviours for life are formed, with Sarah Leeming. The second is low traffic neighbourhoods, which reduce traffic in residential streets to reduce health and traffic dangers and encourage active travel for everyone. Simon Pratt and myself will talk about our new guide for residents and our online guide for our campaigners there. And the third topic is 15-minute neighbourhoods, where residential areas should be planned so that residents can find the services they need after a short walk. And Brenda, Boardman and Alison will examine how far that should be, what services it should include, and other policy implications. We must think inclusively about these things. So a 15-minute walk for an unencumbered adult becomes a 20-minute walk for a parent pushing a baby buggy, 30 minutes for a person using a rollator or a wheelchair. It might be impossible if the pavement is blocked. And so with that inclusive travel, active travel in mind, we couldn't have a better keynote speaker than Dr. Kay Inckle, a hand cyclist, a social scientist, and campaigns and policy manager for Wheels for Wellbeing, a disabled people's active travel organisation and charity. Kay is going to tell us about the why, what, and how of inclusive active travel. Over to you, Kay.
Thank you, and I'm just going to share my screen as well. Thanks very much. So thank you for inviting me to speak. As Robin said, I'm campaigns and policy manager for an organisation called Wheels for Wellbeing. We're a disabled people's cycling organisation, and we campaign for and provide access to cycling for disabled people within an ethos of mobility justice. And today what I'm going to talk about quite briefly is the why, what and how of inclusive active travel for disabled people, predominantly focusing on cycling, but of course active travel is broader than that and includes other kinds of walking and wheeled mobilities. So first of all, we might want to ask, why is inclusive active travel important for disabled people? And there's a number of reasons for this. So first of all, currently in the UK, there are really significant transport and mobility inequalities for disabled people. There is still only rudimentary and partial access to so-called public transport. So anyone who's tried to use a train or a bus has probably been aware that there's very limited spaces for people with disabilities using mobility aids or assistance animals, and that these tend to be unreliable and also difficult to access, particularly on a bus when many pavements don't provide access for disabled people. Moreover, usually on public transport, only one disabled person can travel at any one time, meaning that if you've got a family or a group of friends that include more than one disabled person, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to all travel on the same train and definitely not on the same bus. More than 40% of stations in the UK, that's train stations, remain inaccessible, and disabled people make 38% journeys less than non-disabled people across all transport modes. And that's actually also including the private car, which is usually what many disabled people end up relying on because public transport and other forms are not accessible. So disabled people face significant barriers to transport and mobility. There are also huge health inequalities. So disabled people have the worst mental and physical outcomes of any population group within the UK. And people tend to assume that there's a straightforward correlation between having a disability and being in poor health. But this is actually untrue. So if we think of someone for it as an easy example, with a sensory disability, such as being blind or deaf or hard of hearing, there is no reason for that to be directly linked to ill health. And we see that across all disability groups, but the ill health comes around because of the barriers to exercise, to physical activity, and to accessing the things that promote good health. So really, the causes of the health inequalities are predominantly structural causes. And again, this was evident during the pandemic. So 60% of COVID deaths in England and Wales were disabled people. And again, many of these were structurally caused, given the lack of physical activity and health of disabled people because of forced immobility. Many disabled people experienced some of the conditions that made people more vulnerable to negative outcomes from COVID, such as being overweight, such as having cardiovascular health issues. And also many disabled people are in recipients of social care or living care facilities where we know, again, there was a significant failure to provide the protection from COVID that was needed. So the health inequalities that disabled people face are very much social structural rather than simply innate to the disability. Disabled people also face significant social exclusion, so access to leisure, cultural, social spaces, and to recreation and social participation. So there's a massive participation gap in many of the things that non-disabled people take for granted. Disabled people also experience huge economic inequalities. So we know that there is a disability pay, employment, education and income gap. And in the UK, poverty and material deprivation are very closely linked to disability. So a household with a disabled person in it is many more times likely to be in poverty or experiencing material deprivation than a household that doesn't include a disabled person. And of course, we know that poverty is also, again, very closely linked to mental and physical health, poor outcomes. So we can see with all of these, lack of access to transport and mobility, health inequalities, economic inequalities and social exclusion, they all reinforce each other and create poor health and mobility for disabled people. Finally, as Robin has already pointed out, we also live in this time of climate breakdown, and everybody should have access to a sustainable means of mobility. So for Wilson Wellbeing, cycling is all of these. It's a form of transport and mobility. It's a form of accessing physical and mental health. It enables social participation. It can potentially offer people access to employment or educational opportunities. And of course, it's one way of beginning to combat climate breakdown. But if all of these reasons are not enough, to persuade people that active travel should be inclusive, there are also some legal and policy obligations. So, for example, the 2010 Equality Act mandates that new infrastructure and public infrastructure and services should all be not only fully accessible, but obliges those providing new infrastructure and new schemes to anticipate the kind of adjustments that disabled people will need in order to access that facility and to have it in place at the outset. So there is a very strong expectation that disabled people's participation has been anticipated and provided for. For local authorities, there is also the public sector equality duty, which prohibits local authorities from doing anything which may disadvantage one of the 9 protected characteristics, disability being one of them. And this is very often explored through instigating an equality impact assessment, although these aren't often used well. So there's a legal obligation. There's also other very strong policy motivations. So the government's Gear Change Report of 2020 has instigated the setup of Active Travel England. It's a national body which is going to oversee active travel infrastructure, and they have a very strong inspectorate capacity within that. So they will be monitoring active travel infrastructure and ensuring it is fully accessible, and local authorities that don't meet the required standards will have potentially have funding withdrawn from their active travel budgets. Much of the standards that Active Travel England are working from are LTM 120, which is the guide to cycle infrastructure, which has very high standards for accessibility. But there are also other guides that you can look at. So of course, I have to mention Wilson Wellbeing's Guide to Inclusive Cycling and Transport for All's Equal Pavements Pledge, which gives 7 very clear points of how to make walking and wheeling infrastructure fully accessible for disabled people. So those are some of the whys. Why should we make active travel inclusive for disabled people? But it's also important to think about the what. Because when we talk about disabled people cycling or disabled cyclists, very often the question that comes back is, really, what? Because we live in a world where the perception of disability and cycling are very much oppositional in the public imagination. So there's an assumption that if you're disabled, you won't be able to do anything, and certainly not cycle. And if you're cycling, particularly a 2-wheel bicycle, there is absolutely no way that you could have a disability. And these are absolutely not true. So our own research at Wales Wellbeing and other research has highlighted that for disabled people, cycling is both easier and safer than walking and wheelchair propulsion. So cycling offers a non-weight bearing form of exercise. It takes pressure off joints. If we have e-assist cycling, it's really helpful for people who have muscular difficulties or people who have limited cardiovascular capacity. And it offers a form of easy mobility for people. And people often also find it safer. So people who walk with mobility aids may encounter balance issues or slip issues with their mobility aids that they don't when they're cycling. So it feels like a safer form of mobility. It's also widely known in medical research that wheelchair propulsion, the motion of pushing wheels over the long term, damages the shoulder joints in a way that, for example, hand cycling doesn't, because the movement of a hand cycle uses the muscle rather than the joint as the primary pressure point. So cycling is easier than walking and wheelchair propulsion. So many disabled people refer to their cycle as their mobility aid. It's their way of getting around. It provides them pain-free, fast, independent, autonomous mobility. And of course, it also has those health and environmental benefits to it. So Wales for Wellbeing, we've been running a campaign, My Cycle, My Mobility Aid. You can see on the slide our most recent post in that series, which a family from Derby talk about how their tandem e-cycle is the primary mobility aid within a family where both a parent and a child has a disability, and that's their means of getting to school, getting to clubs, and doing all the day-to-day activities that a family needs to do. So I've mentioned a tandem e-cycle, so a little bit more on the what of disabled cyclists and the cycles that disabled people use. So our most recent survey found, consistent with other years, that the majority of disabled people actually ride a two-wheel bicycle, so a standard bike, which obviously makes them then is invisible as a disabled person while they're cycling until they get off and it becomes obvious that they have limited ability to walk. So standard bicycles are the most common kinds of cycle that disabled people use at 60%. Just over a quarter of disabled people in our survey use tricycles, including recumbent tricycles. Just over 16% used a hand cycle, either as a wheelchair attachment or as a one-piece cycle. 8.5% use a tandem, and nearly 5% use a cargo or family cycle. But what's also really important to notice in these figures is that 1/3 nearly of our respondents also have e-assist. So e-assist cycles can be really essential in making a cycle functional for a disabled person. And that can be anything from a two-wheel bicycle to a recumbent tricycle that's propelled with the hands. And a quarter said that their cycle was folding. And again, that's really important because larger cycles can create problems in terms of storage for people, especially people living in high density or old housing that has narrow doorways, lack of lifts, and so on, and can be really difficult to store a cycle. So disabled people use a range of different cycles. It's also worth noting that when we're talking about disabled people and cycling, we're talking across the spectrum of disability experiences. So people with physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, learning disabilities, people who experience neurodiversity, people with mental health conditions, people with long-term health conditions, and age-related disabilities as well. So there's a huge range of people that cycling becomes a really functional and positive form of mobility for. And again, you can see more details about this in our guide to inclusive cycling. So that's a little bit about the why and the what. So the last section then is the how. How do we make active travel and cycling inclusive and accessible for disabled people? So again, year on year, our survey has shown a significant range of barriers for disabled people cycling, and they tend to show up in this or a very similar order of priority. So, for example, infrastructural barriers, so cycleways that are too narrow, that are stepped, that have really steep camber, poor surface, or that stop, and as the picture on the slide shows, orders that cyclists dismount and push their cycle. All of those things can prevent disabled people cycling, whether they're using a two-wheel bicycle or a bigger non-standard cycle. We saw really significant problems with this during the pandemic, where a lot of pop-up infrastructure, both for walking and cycling, was inaccessible and not meeting basic standards for inclusion. Parking and storage can also be an issue for disabled cyclists. So again, the picture on the slide shows one of those two-tier cycle hangers, which is based again on the idea that everybody rides a two-wheel bike and can pick that up and lift that into an overhead hanger. Cost is another huge barrier. So if you're looking for an e-assist hand cycle or tricycle, your starting price is going to be around £3,500, going up to £6,500 to £7,000. And again, that's a huge amount of money, but given, as we know, the income and pay gap for disabled people, it's a double barrier. The people who are faced with the highest cost of cycling have the least income. And that also connects then with the fact that there are very few opportunities for disabled people to hire or loan a cycle. So we're starting to see the rollout of lots of on-street shared bikes, e-bikes, other active travel equipment available, but there is a very rarely / never accessible options for disabled people. So again, it's the people who most need these low-cost options have the least opportunities to access them. And then finally, sometimes a surprise to non-disabled people, but there's also really significant levels of public hostility, abuse and hate crime towards disabled people. So nearly a quarter of our survey participants reported experiencing abuse when they're cycling. And this is very specifically disability related abuse. So if we're going to overcome those barriers, what do we need to do? What are the enablers? Well, first of all, is obviously address all those barriers. So deal with the infrastructure, parking, cost, hire and loan, attitudinal barriers. But a couple of other really interesting points came out of our survey, one of which is access to safe and supportive cycling environments. And people talked about a range of different environments providing the safe infrastructure that they felt enabled them to cycle. So that can be anything from the opportunity to cycle in an off-road centre, particularly for people who are learning to cycle for the first time or need to try out different kinds of cycles. Off-road tracks, so tracks that are through parks, away from traffic, often using old canal or railway paths, can be fantastic, except very often they then have barriers like A-frames or kissing gates that prevent disabled people from accessing them. Segregated cycleways on the road and low traffic or no traffic environments were also the most popular in terms of enabling disabled people to feel confident about cycling. And secondly, what we don't often think about in terms of cycling is the importance of public transport. So we need a public transport system that allows disabled people to bring their cycle on board, that allows more than one disabled person to travel at a time. And this is much less restricted in terms of the very small amount of space that is usually given for disabled people's travel. For disabled people to use active travel, we need a lot more space on public transport to be available. And I think the other point to make is if we get all these enablers in place and overcome those barriers, we're making cycling and active travel accessible for everybody, not just disabled people, but older people, parents who are cycling with children, businesses wanting to transition to using cargo cycles, temporary injured people, children cycling on their own, and so on and so on. These things make cycling accessible for everybody, not just disabled people. So to finish, just a few more things if you want to do a bit more of the how of inclusive active travel. Of course, I'm going to pitch our guide to inclusive cycling again. But I would really recommend looking at Transport for All and the Equal Pavement Pledge in terms of looking at equal and accessible walking and wheeling environments. And I guess everybody knows LTM 120 off by heart at this stage, but if you don't, please do have a look at it, because it offers some really important guidance, particularly in terms of the sizing for cycle lanes, and overcoming some of the barriers in infrastructure. There is also a slide with references on if you want to follow any of that up, which we can share in the chat. And then if you have any questions beyond the question and answer session we're going to have today, or want any further information about Wales Wellbeing, the contact details are there. So I'll leave it there, and thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Kay. That was I've seen you talk before, and once again, that's a real eye-opener. I find it an area where the more you learn, the more you realise you don't know. I'm involved with the Inclusive Travel Mobility Group, focus group in Oxford, and the sheer range of disabilities and needs that are expressed within that group is really important to understand, because the needs there's just such a wide range of needs that need to be coped with if we're to make an inclusive travel world, no matter what transport modes we're talking about, whether it's active travel, public transport, or cars for that matter. So it's very helpful to have that in-depth knowledge that you bring, and the references to follow up later. But we shall move on now to a very a different, though sometimes overlapping group of people, young people, children going to school. And Sarah Leeming, you may know her from Sustrans, you may know her from Abingdon Liveable Streets. It's going to talk about some research into school travel. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Robin. Just before that, I wanted to really acknowledge Kay's point about cycles as mobility aids. My partner's grandfather is 99 and he uses a tricycle to get to the local shops. He's unable to do it by foot, but he can do it on his trike. So amazing. And of course, he can do it because his shop is nearby to him, which very much ties into more of the presentation material you'll hear later today. So from an older generation to a younger generation, I'm here this afternoon to talk about a piece of research that CoHSAT undertook with funding from Low Carbon Oxford Hub grant. It's actually someone called Nadine Matu who did the research, but I'm here to present on behalf of Nadine today. Next slide, please. So the research was very much on trying to understand the perspectives of car drivers. So trying to understand why parents or carers continue to drive on the school run. We focused the research on a number of schools that have been lucky enough to be a recipient of Oxfordshire's first school street pilot. And we wanted to focus on these schools because these schools have had a number of active travel initiatives. They received a number of active travel initiatives from the county council in terms of travel behaviour, engagement, resources and training, various kind of schemes and initiatives trying to encourage active travel, of which the School Streets was one of those initiatives. School Streets, for anyone that doesn't know, they are basically an initiative that puts in a barrier. So it actually restricts car drivers from going into the school area. It doesn't restrict residents, but it basically restricts through traffic at the site of the school gates. We received 81 responses from 5 of the school streets from parents that we carried out research with, and then an additional 14 responses from 2 other schools. So we wanted to use the findings to inform future research and policy and infrastructure schemes and behaviour change initiatives. So I'll conclude at the end with a number of recommendations. Next slide, please. So yeah, so just going back to the school street context, then yes, we work with Oxfordshire County Council. The school streets pilots were delivered in Oxford, Bicester, Witney and Abingdon. So there were 9 6-week trials closing the road outside the school gates to motorised traffic to enable safer walking, scooting and cycling. So those schools, some of you might be familiar with them. They were Windmill School, St Christopher's, East Oxford, Lark Rise and St Ebbs. And that's in Oxford. And then in Bicester, we had St Edburgh's and Bure Park. And in Witney, Tower Hill and St Nicholas School in Abingdon. So despite the relative success of school streets, and the school streets pilots were by and large successful, they certainly, you can see from the photos down the right hand side here, you can see how those environments outside school gates are clearly quite calmer and safer for parents and children. If you want to know more about the actual School Streets project, then I put a link into a story map there. I'm sure these presentation slides will be shared and you can read more about the actual School Streets pilots. However, despite the school streets, stubborn driver behaviour, it does, parents still, many parents still feel that the best way for them to do the school run is by using a motor car. So we wanted to get to the bottom of why that is. Next slide, please. So we ran some focus groups. We wanted to run focus groups because they were seen as a way of targeting the parents whose feedback might best inform the research objectives. COVID did impact on this. We did this research back in towards the sort of end of the summer, beginning of the academic year last year. So unfortunately, even though we wanted to run the focus groups in person, we did have to switch those to online. So there was some limited success with the online sessions taking place. So we had 4 online sessions with only 7 attendees actually turning up, but we did receive some written email responses as well. So we adapted the methodology, and this diagram here just kind of takes you through the different types of methodology that were used. We did some online surveys, and then Nadine actually went in person and did some surveys directly outside the school gates. So this gave us 95 responses in total. And next slide, please. So we deliberately didn't want to, I suppose we wanted to design the questions and the sub-question prompts so that they were as constructive as possible. So we were trying to obviously gently elicit the barriers to active travel, rather than the parents feeling that they had to sternly defend their travel mode choice of the motor car. So next slide, please. So these are the core questions here, and yeah, just give you an opportunity to read those. You see we were just trying to elicit the information from the participants. Next slide, please. So here are the results. We split these into thematic areas. So first of all, we have the driving positives. So these are the elements that participants feel were their key elements to why they were choosing to drive. Probably these won't be of any massive surprise to you. So we've got convenience, ease of driving. That's the top recurring theme. People feel that driving gives them the opportunity to do multi-stop journeys, so they can do the school run and they can also go to work. They can also drop off their children for extracurricular activities. Example, they can transport heavy items. So they could quickly see that there was some benefits for them. Equally, time saving, that was a key recurring theme. They found that driving was less stressful, although there's counter arguments to that from other people, that driving saves time and therefore allows family routines to be maintained, and that it's direct and quicker than other modes. Some people said that they felt they had no other choice but to drive to school. And the main reason for this was because they live far away from the school. Sometimes this had been a result of them having to move away from their original locality near to the school. Other parents reported that they chose a better school, which was further away. Other parents reported that their children did not get close to the school via their first choice of school preference. So that clearly had an impact as well. Also, people reported that they used an electric vehicle. So some people actually felt that that was a positive, that they weren't polluting the atmosphere as much as if they were driving in a standard motor car. Moving on to driving negatives, it's interesting. I think people generally acknowledge that driving caused congestion. 22 of the responses acknowledge that driving causes congestion and traffic issues. There are also quite a number of responses in relation to the environmental impact. So people did acknowledge that driving had an environmental impact. Other people, but certainly in the minority, acknowledged that driving was a less healthy option. Fuel expense back when we did this research wasn't an issue, but indeed that may be an issue more recently with petrol prices increasing. So we then wanted to elicit the active travel and sustainable transport barriers. And these were fairly evenly spread across the thematic areas that you see here now. But the main ones that were picked out here, or the most frequent recurring themes, were a low sense of safety around active travel infrastructure or inadequate infrastructure. So these were the two main barriers that were cited. The next ones that were fairly prevalent were age. So older parents, carers, grandparents said that they found it harder to travel actively due to being older. Also, families travelling with babies or infants often had a lack of trust in the child's independence and road safety awareness. Many parents and carers consider their children able to walk or cycle more when they're younger adults or older children. So they felt it was very much something that they should do in the future rather than now. Other people cited inefficient public transport, that if that was actually better, then that would encourage them to think about alternative modes to travelling to school. I think we're back on if you just go back one slide. So mode shift enablers. So these are the things that the parents said would encourage them to consider travelling to school differently. So the top one was improved active travel infrastructure. And they talked about segregated and traffic-free cycle lanes nearer to the school. And they talked about safer crossings. They talked about more and better lighting. And they talked about more facilities for families and babies with children under 5 to make it easier for parents to walk with a stroller. And they talked about better cycle parking. The next most recurring response was lifestyle. Some people felt that they could actually potentially change their lifestyle, so live closer to the school. Or if they were to change their working hours, get another job, then that could also encourage mode shift. Other people also highlighted how having children in one family attending the same school would encourage them to travel differently. Other people cited the fact that perhaps if they walked with a group of friends to school, that would encourage them as well. Okay, next slide, please. A few other comments were made. These were largely location specific. There were also some general comments made in terms of the impact of COVID and indeed the impact of the low traffic neighbourhoods that went in Oxfordshire, in Oxford. Next slide, please. So the research makes a number of recommendations. So I won't go through them all here, but to summarise, aside from the improvements in active travel infrastructure, There's a need to focus on aligning work with school and public transport timings to accommodate people's lifestyles and family routines. It was thought that bus timings, bus stops, bus reliability and routes could also be reviewed to ensure that they serve the needs of the community. And that the availability of bus transport also needs to be at low or no cost. School admission policies, it felt that this perhaps is often overlooked, that school admission policies could consider the factors of distance and travel more. If there is no other option than to put a child in a school further away than their closest one because of lack of places, then is there anything that can be done to support these children in terms of how they get to school right from when they start? There could also be additional information in school admission packs, with the school proactively setting their expectations around active travel. Finally, more and sustained active travel education and training for parents. So certainly the County Council does do this, but the recommendation here is more and sustained. So ideally sustained levels of funding to enable ongoing good levels of education and training for parents, school staff and children. So for example, ongoing campaigns and resources around active travel to portray the health benefits and indeed perhaps the disbenefits of using motorised transport. Also, schools, children and parents need to access active travel equipment and training such as cycle training, cycle maintenance and route planning. So those were the key recommendations. I don't think there's anything groundbreaking in there, but I think certainly I think one of the main takeaways would be something around school admissions, whether anything in that regard could be more proactively looked at. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that was a really terrific view of a very practical intervention on the streets around schools and an understanding of where it's been working and why and what can be done to enhance it. So I hope that was useful. I'm just looking at the people attending, and I can see we've got some of the councillors that are involved in making decisions around this this type of scheme. Council officers and campaigners. I know someone's here from Merseyside even tuning in, so really good section. So now our next topic is talk about low traffic neighbourhoods and some of the guides that we've been developing. A guide for residents and a guide for campaigners. And this time I'm actually handing over to myself for the first one of these, and then my colleague and friend Simon Pratt. So the first one, the LTN Residents Guide. Next slide, please. Is something we've developed for the residents of low traffic neighbourhoods or coming low traffic neighbourhoods. Why did we need this? Well, there's lots of information about low traffic neighbourhoods, which are really areas designed to reduce the amount of motor traffic coming through residential areas. And but there's not really much that is designed to inform the residents in easily to digest language. So there are guides for policymakers, there are guides for designers, there are guides for campaigners. Indeed, Simon will tell you about one of our own we designed based on our own experiences here in Oxford, but nothing that was much good for residents. What do they see instead? Well, let's have a look at the next slide. Well, they see consultation letters and maybe what are called ETRO letters, which are experimental traffic regulation orders, which are quite technical, quite wordy, and have to be written in a very specific way. And then they may see some of the anti-low traffic neighbourhood leaflets that some of the protesters against these things have produced, which are not altogether unbiased. and not altogether truthful. And this does not exactly give them the best set of friendly and useful information. So if we can have the next slide, please. We set out to produce something that was engaging and accessible, that explains why LTNs are needed, explains what they are, that tackles some of the questions, the issues and the myths, and is honest and evidence-based. And we developed that within the CoHSAT team, kind of did the research, thought quite a lot about what the information was and how to present it. And having developed the kind of the content and then the words behind it, I worked with one of the teams who is quite good on the graphic design to turn that into a visual medium in the form of an A5 leaflet, which is well, we'll see a picture of it later. So we go to the next slide, please. So if you imagine an A4 piece of paper that's then folded in two, this is the front cover of that. The front cover starts with being engaging and accessible, large friendly letters, as I like to think of it, and introduces a bit about why you need low traffic neighbourhoods, aims to entice people in, talking about the reason that you really need them is that traffic has been increasing, doubling since the 1980s, and this can make it very hard for people living in residential streets where sat-navs are now leading drivers through those streets in a way that didn't happen before. And low traffic neighbourhoods, many have existed for decades, but they've really come to the fore with this name as a solution to this type of situation. Next slide, please. And if you open up the leaflet on the left-hand side, it explains why. Because traffic growth brings a whole series of problems, injury risk, air pollution, physical inactivity, climate change, and so forth. And on the right-hand side, go to the next slide, please. There's a bit about what, explaining what a low traffic neighbourhood is. They don't stop you actually driving places, they make some journeys longer. And one of the bits that we found the hardest on this is this little diagram on the bottom right, where we try and convey in a very simple diagrammatic form how a traffic filter works. We tried about 7 or 8 different iterations of this before settling on this one. It's very hard to describe in a simple diagram. And then, yeah, we can go to page 4 of it now, the next slide. On the final page of it, on the back cover, if you like, the myths and facts. Do people like low traffic neighbourhoods? Well, yes, if you ask the residents, they do. Do they increase traffic? Well, overall, no, because people demonstrably choose to walk and cycle more. You can get some effects on boundary roads anyway. I won't explain it here and now. You can read the leaflet online. I'll give you the link in a second. There are some myths about delaying emergency vehicles. The question of how they affect disabled people is a quite complex one. So we've tried to tackle that. But most importantly, we link to the sources, and on the CoHSAT website now is a low traffic neighbourhoods evidence page where it links to the more detailed sources and evidence that we've used to compile this. And if we go to the next page, this is how we collected them using active travel, of course, and a bike and trailer to pick up the leaflets. And there is one of the leaflets that even this week is going through people's doors in East Oxford, where some 3 more low traffic papers are due to be installed in May. And a link to the website where they are, in fact, both of the project I'm talking about here and one Simon is going to be talking about next. So I hope that is useful, and that provides a useful resource for us all to explain low traffic neighbourhoods to people, ideally before they happen. Right, let's move on from there to the other side of the Low Traffic Neighbourhoods project, which is Simon Pratt talking about the campaigners guide that we've developed. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Robin. One thing that Robin didn't mention was that both these projects were financed by the Low Carbon Hub, to whom we're very grateful. And obviously a lot of volunteer time was used preparing them. So this is a complementary guide. Robin's, I think you've got the impression they were physically printed. 10,000 of those leaflets are available. They're currently stored in my shed. So if you want to know more, contact the CoHSAT email address. Alongside the printed leaflets, we thought it would be useful to produce a guide, but this is an online guide. We're not proposing to publish this even as a separate PDF, but as an online resource. And it's based on our experience here in Oxford. Next slide, please. So we, this was based on our experience, based on documents and notes that were produced at the time, official documentation from the council, press releases, and so on, and also based on interviews with local people, with councillors, council officers, campaigners, and local residents to get a broad view on what actually happened, how we got there. And we summarised these in 10 key learning points. So this is the first of 10, learning from others. And the particular inspiration for us was Waltham Forest. And this is on the left in the picture, you can see Councillor Clyde Lokes in Waltham Forest and a group of council officers and councillors from Oxfordshire who were all, you can see they're very happy. They were inspired by what had been achieved in Waltham Forest. And I've just simply listed the types of events that we had to bring people from Waltham Forest to Oxford to spread the word. Next slide, please. We wanted to, it's obviously important to work together with other groups, and part of the reason I think we can claim some credit for this for the low traffic neighbourhoods in Oxford is the formation of CoHSAT, which happened in January 2019. But prior to that, there was an inspirational event organised by our colleague Scott Urban at the beginning of 2018, which led to a number of us forming a new organisation, Oxford and Liveable Streets, which was one of the founder members of CoHSAT. And at the time in 2018, low traffic neighbourhoods were not really a big focus for us. It was much more about reducing traffic, particularly through the city centre. And you may have heard about Connecting Oxford plans. We were promoting Connecting Oxford Plus with additional traffic restriction points. And obviously low traffic neighbourhoods fit into that broader view, but we think you can't really do one without the other. So we're very much looking forward to the next step in that. Next one, please. Local councillors, very important. There's a little bit of a chronology here that our local councillor in Cowley was pretty supportive from the start, John Sanders. He's since retired. He's pictured there on the left. But an opportunity arose much more quickly than we had anticipated. It was one of the few benefits of the pandemic and lockdown. The government launched the Emergency Active Travel Fund. Councillor Sanders proposed 3 low traffic neighbourhoods as funded from that government funding. And I know that local council elections are happening next week in Oxford. But interesting note here from last year with the county council elections, Charlie Hicks, pictured there on the right, was John Sanders's successor, and he won an increased vote. despite very actively campaigning in favour of low traffic neighbourhoods. Next one, please. And whilst support from the local councillors is very welcome and very important, often for various reasons, the decision makers tend to be more sceptical. It's important to really keep them informed. So we had a number of public events where we invited senior officers and councillors. First of those was an in-person meeting. We invited Clyde Blokes, pictured there, to an event in the town hall. When lockdown started, those discussions continued online, and in fact they were really positive in the sense that they pretty much held weekly or fortnightly throughout the first year of the pandemic, and it was a simple and easy way to get people together, perhaps in a way that we wouldn't have done without. Next one, please. Providing positive stories to local media. I'll start rattling through these. I've just had a note saying we've got to speed up a bit. Again, reference there to Councillor Sanders, and we did develop a relationship with the media, so they came to us for quotes when key points in the development of these LTNs. Next one, please. Keeping local residents informed is really important. We had a number of public meetings, but particularly right on the ground level, both for those who were particularly interested to get a group of local supporters, but then not forgetting that to have public meetings, some of those were quite vociferous, as you might imagine, but we need to, as long as we were properly prepared and had robust arguments, I think most people went away thinking, reluctantly accepting the support. During that first lockdown, the picture on the right there is of a public exhibition that we were able to hold in Oxford city centre. And although we didn't get, we got over 300 people visiting, but I think the impact was much wider. We had a lot of press activity around that as well. Next one, please. And if things aren't going as quickly as you'd hoped, our advice is to be prepared to put your own money in, or at least to fundraise for the first of the three, or the one that was most advanced in Florence Park in Oxford. We raised £8,500 to pay for a professional proposal and some publicity around that. We had a mini Holland weekend in Florence Park, in the park itself. And shortly after, obviously, the designs were published, and hopefully we think those influenced the final outcome in Florence Park. Next slide, please. This all happened relatively quickly in Oxford with the government funding that came in. But we wanted to make sure that the council had all the right levers. It's important to get low traffic neighbourhoods included in local policy, sending letters of support to councillors, helping them through the difficult periods where the anti-LTN groups are getting active. And just to summarise what the level of support in the first three in Oxford, ranging from 59% to 79% support from residents. And of course, like in all these surveys, not every resident responds, so you might expect a slight increased number of those anti-people actually responding to a consultation. It's always difficult to read into it, but in any event, comfortable majorities, which gave the councillors the confidence to implement. And final slide, please. Sorry, it's not the final one. And be ready with arguments. What Robin has already mentioned, on our website, we've collected together a lot of the myths and references to other places where you can get help and advice. So there are three strands to our advice on the website. There's Robin's leaflet, there's this campaigner's guide, and there's an evidence library. And finally, once the planters are installed, encourage local people to look after them. This is an unfortunate image. In fact, this has recently been, very recently, just in the last few days, replaced with a spanking brand new planter. So that somebody, an arsonist, attempted to set this box into flames, but Charlie there was, there was a lot of, you can just about make out the messages from local residents saying, this is terrible. Thank you very much. Back to Robin.
Thank you, Simon. That was really terrific. And we'll put the link to this. And in fact, the projects are very easy to find. All the projects are easy to find from the CoHSAT website. You just go to cohsat.org.uk and head for the projects tab. You'll very quickly find all of the projects we're talking about today. And there's Simon's one being an online guide is very nicely presented with the help of Simon and Nor, who's been a great help to us both in presenting these. So we now move on to the final main topic for today, 15-minute neighbourhoods, where Brenda and Alison are going to talk about the survey that we ran and policy paper that's come out of that. Over to you.
Thank you, Robin. I'm Alison Hill. I'm chair of Cyclox, a cycle campaign group, and previous co-chair of CoHSAT, and really value the fact that CoHSAT has done a huge amount for active travel and healthy streets in Oxfordshire. We were very lucky to get a grant this is the third year of grants from the Low Carbon Hub. And I just want to reflect back to last year. One of our pieces of work was to develop a walkability index for Oxford City with the help of a Cyclox member called Will Ray. And this was part of a data project, and we were thinking about what amenities would people want to have locally. We took a guess about the amenities, and that we've addressed schools, supermarkets, GP surgeries, pubs, and green space. But we knew that was our guess of what people wanted locally in their local areas to access. So the survey that Brenda's going to describe after my session is really amplifying that and really understanding what people want locally. But you can see here that with combining the different indices, produces a map which shows that some communities in Oxford have very easy access to amenities. Some, and particularly out in the periphery, are very remote from local amenities. And I mean, sadly, it's often those poorer communities like in Blackbird, Lees, and Barton that have less access to their local amenities. And so the whole issue of walkability, cyclability has a strong social justice and inclusive element. So very much the theme of this conference. So going on to this prompted Brenda and I to work on what is a 15-minute neighbourhood. So next slide, please. So a 15-minute neighbourhood is something that's become an interest to people, well, cities all over the world. It's about creating places where most of people's daily needs are met within a short walk or cycle. The 15 minutes tends to be about walking rather than cycling, because you can get much further on a bicycle. And Paris and Melbourne and other cities are leading the way. And as you know, Paris has just transformed in a matter of 5 years really under the leadership of the mayor, Anne Dargo. And it's now a cycling and walking city. It's quite extraordinary. Sometimes they're called 15-minute neighbourhoods, and the Town and Country Planning Association calls it 20 minutes, but that actually means 10 minutes each way. And Brenda and I do prefer to call this 15-minute neighbourhoods, approximately 3/4 of a mile, 1 mile if you're a very fast walker each way. And we like that as well because the 30 minutes exercise a day, it meets the Chief Medical Officer's recommendations, the UK Chief Medical Officer's recommendations of 30 minutes 5 times per 5 days a week. And the benefits are that they reduce the need to travel, to travel out of the community, they promote active travel, they boost the local economy, bringing in businesses, they improve people's health and well-being, and improve social connections and tackle climate change. And all of this is because it gets people out of their cars and gives them a choice of walking and cycling. So the next slide, please. And kind of going back to Kay's presentation, this is definitely a social justice issue because many communities do not, many people in communities do not own cars. In the 2017 survey done by DFT, 22% of households have no car. And in the lowest income decile, 65% of households have no car. And therefore, it's essential that they have local amenities because otherwise their transport costs are high going outside their area. And Oxford is one of the councils with one of the lowest car ownership. The 2011 census showed that 33% of households have no car. There's a question about if your household is dependent on cars and one adult and there's only one car, then there is social isolation for the person remaining. And then unrelated to car ownership, 26% of adults have no driving license, which is quite surprising. And that's increasing. Young people do not are increasingly not learning to drive. Though the whole issue for CoHSAT, of course, is about rural communities and the fact that owning a car is essential in a rural community, but it does lead to financial strains. And increasingly, they wouldn't have owned a car in an urban setting. So can you move on to the next slide? So Brenda's going to be talking about the survey, but that's summarised as well in our policy document. And I'm just going through briefly the policy recommendations. We think the 15-minute neighbourhood term is a better one than 20-minute neighbourhood, so that's a key recommendation. Local plans and local transport and connectivity plans need to have 15-minute or 20-minute neighbourhood as a key policy. And in fact, I went through all the local plans and only Oxford City kind of assumes 15-minute neighbourhoods, but doesn't actually use the term. And I think that needs to be adopted now. We're recommending interactive mapping of access to amenities, and we've been talking to the public health team in the county council who are interested to do that so that we can actually address see where those communities are that don't have good access to local amenities. One of the key things is that, of course, there may be local amenities, but with very poor access for cycling and walking. And so the local transport and connectivity plan must ensure attractive active travel routes. The Oxfordshire Street Design Guide, when it gets next updated, needs to meet national design standards and again, ensure connectivity for all developments as they happen in the county. New housing needs to be truly affordable because one of the risks is that if you create an attractive local community with local amenities, it might bring in people who are, who are wealthier. So it's really there. This is again an issue of social justice. Local communities need to support need the support to actively engage. I mean, Brenda's got some interesting stories about visiting local communities, and I hope she gets a chance to mention that if we've got the time, because they didn't realise that they do have powers of their own. And we also are worried about what the new planning bill will bring, and so as we don't know yet when that's coming in, but that's going to be a key aspect to lobby for. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm handing over to Brenda, voice willing. You're muted, Brenda.
We undertook this survey just before Christmas, and we did it in the whole of Oxfordshire because we wanted to establish what people in the whole county, whether they lived in a village or an urban centre, wanted in terms of their basic amenities. And first of all, we asked people how far they were prepared to walk. And as you can see from this, I hope, that everybody's going to walk at least 5 minutes. And actually, the 15-minute limit is reached and acceptable to 75% of the households. And once you get to 20 minutes one way, that's up to 41%. So it's very definitely and clearly 15 minutes is acceptable to a very substantial group of the population. Thank you. Next slide. We asked them about 19 basic amenities. Now, we selected those 19. There was a bit of debate about it, and we might do it slightly differently the next time. But what we got out of the whole sample, that's 450 replies that we could use, by far the greatest number of people wanted to have a park or other green space nearby. And then a shop selling basics, a post office, a GP surgery or health centre, a separate pharmacy, and a supermarket were the top 6. So health and shopping were 2 of the very big issues. With the others, there were a variety of proportions that wanted them. The one that slightly surprised us was that nobody particularly asked in their top 6. This is, we asked people to identify their top 6. The service office spaces were not identified, but then of course it was taking place during COVID and a lot of people were working from home. Thank you. Next one. We also separately asked with each of the 19 how many people have it and want it, don't have it and would like it, have it and don't use it, and don't have and don't want. And there was a very substantial range, of course, within each of these. So 97% of people have and want a green space or park. And as I mentioned, a service office space is not seen as a major necessity. People, when responding to this set of questions, were not limited to 6. They could put in any, they just responded to each one. So 7% would like and wanted and have a serviced office space. 29% don't have and would like to have a bike shop. Now, I might say it looks as if we had a very bike skewed set of respondents, and that may well be true. We can't really show that. But what I would say about our survey is that it was very representative, not entirely accurately. But we had more pensioners than you would have expected for a survey in Oxfordshire. So the fact that lots of our pensioners want bike shops is very good. The proportion, therefore, of people who responded with children in their family was quite small. So we only had 1% of respondents who don't have and would like a playground. 64% have and do not use their local church or faith centre, and 5% looked at the post office in the same way. 25% don't have and don't want a gym, and 3% a pub. The pub was one of those amenities that varied according to where you lived. If you were in a small village, you were much more likely to want a pub. If you lived in a larger area, conurbation, you wanted a pub and a cafe. Next one, please. We are, by the way, going to hand this data set over to the County Council, so they will be able to do more analysis and into the things that interest them the most. So we're hoping it will provide further support for policies in future. We asked everybody if they would for comments. And the one thing that came over most strongly was that if people are going to walk, they want to make sure they have a path or a cycle route that is attractive. Many people said that they would like to walk into the village centre, but there were too many people parking on the pavement, there was too much congestion, there was too much pollution, etc. Which is a way of saying that if the county council could reduce the density of car travel in many of these areas, we would get more people walking, even with the present amenities. We think that with new amenities, we should particularly focus on face-to-face meeting, partly because, for instance, with shops, you don't sort of increase the sense of community so much, not if it's a supermarket anyway, and lots of people work shopping online. With transport links, not every village can have all of the basic amenities, and there is a debate to be had as to whether it's the 6 or more of the 19, but there should maybe sort of consortia of villages. So this one's got a gym and that one's got a pub, for instance. As Alison says, we want new housing to be affordable and to be near the centre to make the amenities viable and increase population density. The distance people would walk was further to a pub than a shop. I'm not quite sure how much that's to do with the pub, but it's certainly that when you go back home from the shop, you've got some shopping to carry, and that could be heavy. We don't understand, a bit like Sarah's work on school streets, we don't understand why people are prepared to drive short distances. We were not able to ask whether the local amenities that were provided a good service or whether they were expensive, etc., etc. The 19 amenities did not include a library, hardware shop, recycling facilities, broadband. Particularly sad we didn't include broadband, bookshop, secondary school, etc. Next one. Right. Oh, well, the last thing that I would say, as Alison mentioned, we're very keen that local communities start looking at what is provided in their area and think about their opportunities to improve. Some of those will require assistance from the health service or the local authority, if it's a school or a health centre, for instance, but some of them can be done by the community itself if they want to. It might be that the local shop is there, but it's a bit expensive or not in the right place, and they might think of trying to improve it. We're very keen to encourage local councillors talking to local communities about what can be done to improve the inclusivity of that particular locality, because that is the way in which we will encourage people to have a better quality of life, better health, and make sure that they don't need to get in their car, and especially don't need a car. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Alison. And thank you, Brenda, for persevering with your sore throat. All came across loud and clear to me. Robin is having connection problems on his sojourn in Cornwall, so has asked me to carry on. I was going to moderate this next session on questions anyway. So please do continue to post in the chat if you have any questions arising from some of the initial responses. We have had a few. I was going to ask Kay to say a little bit more. I know you very kindly replied in the chat, Kay, to 2 of the questions that came through, but I'm particularly interested in EQIA and from a professional point of view, and it'd be really helpful if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. So equality impact assessments, they have to be used when a new service or piece of infrastructure is going in to check. So it's part of the Equality Act to check that no one with any of the 9 protected characteristics is disadvantaged by it. I think one of the difficulties with them as sort of the culture around them as they're currently used is because there is an allowance within them for sort of an unavoidable disadvantage and a mitigation to be put in place. They have become something that's a little bit of a tick box exercise, and people, you know, go straight to the mitigation, which is very often a very poor quality mitigation, which doesn't really address the problem. So one of the things that we've been discussing with Department for Transport as they set up Active Travel England is really starting to address some of the culture around that. So Active Travel England in their inspectorate capacity will be looking at new schemes, but they will also be interested in the standard of equality impact assessments that are carried out. So we've been working with them to really sort of encourage a culture shift so that everybody doesn't sort of move directly to the mitigations and sort of do some simple tick boxing, but really sees that as a very last resort that's only going to be accepted in rare cases, that really the equality impact assessment should be guiding people back to the design and really rethinking about the ways that they can be used to make things fully accessible and inclusive. So, and I mean, again, I think, again, one of the problems with equality impact assessments is they were not used on a lot of the pop-up infrastructure because it was on an emergency basis and they weren't seen as necessary. And that has been one of the things that's generated quite a bit of fear and hostility around a lot of active travel infrastructure, because in areas where really poor quality pop-up infrastructure has gone in, people are looking at that and thinking that, okay, is this the standard of what's going to happen, and I can't use it, and it makes it difficult for me or unsafe for me to get the bus now, and so on and so on. So yeah, I think there's those 2 key issues, that they weren't used at all in the pop-up infrastructure, and that, you know, they have become a bit of a tick box, and that culture really needs to shift. But as I say, Active Travel England is really keen on sort of strengthening them, and as an organisation themselves having a really robust equality impact assessment in terms of their own organisation and in terms of when they're reviewing the ones that come back to them.
Thanks, Kay. That's really useful, and that was, you hit the nail on the head. That was my concern, that EQIA seems to be a bit of a tick box exercise at the moment, and I guess the issue there is that people are doing their, you know, the engineers are doing their design work, doing the EQIA at the end of that process. Whereas I think we would all be advocating to say, well, you need to start with your EQIA to say, you know, what are the main principles, you know, what are you trying to achieve here, rather than then say, well, we there's not enough space, so we can't do what we'd ideally like to do. Well, sorry, but you've got to rethink right from the outset.
Yeah, and I think the thing about design is consultation is so important with groups who are going to be impacted and who might be identified as being disadvantaged within the EQIA, to go back to a consultation stage with people and look at the designs and rework them, rather than, you know, again, consultation often comes after the thing's been designed and implemented, and then people say, well, actually, this is just unsafe or inaccessible or not workable. So I think, you know, there should be a much stronger focus on consultation within them at the very early stages of them being done, because it's usually very obvious who is going to be disadvantaged by a current design or proposal. And at the early stage, there is usually a way to redesign that so it's inclusive. It's just because it often comes after, or it's a poor mitigation, it's a very poor substitute for inclusion. And again, that's the sort of thing that raises people's sort of anger and fear and concern about some of the new schemes that are going on, because what they see is something that's excluding them or not safe for them, or has taken away something that they could previously use. So yeah, I think consultation is really essential in making them effective as well.
Great, thanks, Kay. I should have said before starting this session that we won't have an absolute cutoff at 1:30. So if you are able to continue and you feel we're running out of time, don't hesitate for posting a question. All the speakers have been primed to stay at least for another 10 minutes. So do keep those questions coming in. We had one from Tina. I don't know if you picked that up, Brenda or Alison, about the survey method and how people were chosen for that.
I have posted up the link to the survey in the chat, but I think if Brenda would like to...
I'd be grateful, because I've had a quick look. I can't find the methodology, but maybe I need to spend longer hunting for it. If you could just answer those few basic questions, that would be really helpful. About the size of the sample, how the instrument was applied, what demographics were of the population, and whether it's representative.
Tina, we did it all online. As I say, it was in November, December. We used every single possible network that we could. Quite a lot of them were environmental or active travel linked, of course, because those are our main colleagues. But we also tried groups like the WI to get the survey out as widely as possible. As I said, we got 500 responses, but only 450 of those were actually usable. 33% were people who defined themselves as living in a rural area, whereas we would have liked that to have been a bit higher. And in very few cases did we get sufficient numbers in one locality to do a study of a particular village or small hamlet or a small town. The majority, as I said, majority of the people, we had an imbalance, if you like, in favour of people who were pensioners. We would have expected something in the region of 32%, and we got 37%. One of the things that was interesting is that the older people are much more prepared to walk than younger people. We got very few people under 34, and none of them were prepared to walk for 20 minutes. So that was quite interesting. And the people in villages were more prepared to walk than people in towns. That gives you a brief intro to some of the issues that we tackled.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. We've got a couple of questions coming in, lots of comments, which is great. Apparently we've got a raised hand. We should have said we're not doing raised hands on this meeting, unfortunately. So Tim, if you'd like to post a question in the chat, we'll see if we can deal with that. Catherine has a question. Sources of money for inclusive cycling infrastructure. Well, I'll take that initially, because I think it's going to be the usual sources. I think we shouldn't be thinking in terms of infrastructure for inclusive cycling. We should be looking for infrastructure for everyone. And inclusive cycling, walking and wheeling should just simply be part of that overall picture. Kay very eloquently described the current system of EQIAs, and I was about to intervene or amplify her message there, that obviously benefits for people with limited mobility will benefit everybody. So I think it's just the usual sources, and unless you had, I mean, I can't imagine you do, Kay, but if you do have any answer to that question of specifically for inclusive cycling, I think maybe particularly around pilots and that suggestion that came out of our conversation around, trying to do EQIA and consulting with user groups, because that does take time and by definition a bit of money to involve a broad range of groups with as many as possible of the 9 protected characteristics before the engineers put pen to paper.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things with that. I think one, the gear change report and the onset of active travel England has actually flipped it on its head. So now you only get money if your infrastructure has high accessibility standards. So the plan is that becomes the norm, and that is what the main active travel funding schemes will go to, is projects that are showing that they are high accessibility and inclusion standards. There are currently some pilots through the Gear Change project, which are specifically looking at issues of this. So one of them is local authorities who want to try cycles as mobility aids, for example. So, I mean, the window for application for all of those pilot schemes is closed now, to the best of my knowledge. But within that, there has been a focus on looking at aspects of e-bike and share schemes, active travel on prescription, cycles as mobility aids, with funding for local authorities to pilot new approaches to making things accessible. But the plan as this goes forward is that those then will become the norm. So the idea is that accessibility is the norm, and that's what gets funded and not other things. So it is a really big turnaround, and that's really fantastic to see. It is a big change, sort of moving from accessibility as niche to now this is the expected norm, and you won't get support for the scheme if it's not fully accessible.
Thanks, Kay. Yes, there was another point I was going to amplify, that your answer to the question you posted in the chat was really important around the involvement of Active Travel England. And it's only just starting up, but there's some very encouraging signs coming out of that. And certainly the message coming out loud and clear is that local authorities will not be funded unless their schemes are up to scratch based on LTN 120 primarily. And many people here will no doubt be aware that West Sussex County Council were refused funding in active travel round 3 because of the way they handled one of the pop-up lanes, which may not have met inclusive standards, but there was a pop-up lane that was removed after objections, and they didn't allow enough time for that to become a proper trial that could be evaluated. So we're getting towards the end now. We're getting people leaving. Yeah, lots of messages saying thank you, and we're leaving. So I think what I will do, just quickly going back, I don't think lots of useful comments in there. Oh, there was one from Mark Harrison. I was just going to reply to that, but absolutely 20-mile-an-hour speed limits fit into all of this. I'm very pleased to see the County Council policy to introduce 20 miles an hour across the whole county for all built-up areas, not just in cities, but in towns and villages as well. So absolutely 20 mile an hour is part of that mix, and certainly most active travel organisations advocate for 20 miles an hour as the default speed limit in urban areas, rather than 30 and having to make the case each time street by street for 20. I think that was the only other one I wanted to pick up. Yes, Chris Cousins, very important question. I think we're losing some of the people who could answer that, so that will need to wait for another day. So I'm going to pass back to Robin to finish up.
Oh, okay, thank you very much, Simon. And I apologise that my I've had to switch laptop and my camera isn't now working, so you'll have to make do with a picture of me, but I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. I think that was a terrific view of these topics, and I hope you've enjoyed that as much as I did. I think in terms of summarising that, I really think that Kay's title of Why, What and How has been a very good guide. I started us off in terms of reasons why with climate, health and congestion, but she really has added equality and inclusion as themes that have been with us all through today's session. We've seen what in terms of things that people need to reach in terms of services in schools, and we've seen how in terms of things that are both quite strategic in scale, such as 15 minutes neighbourhoods, and also some very practical things in terms of traffic filters and school streets, and local schemes and initiatives that can make that possible. So I hope that will be useful to people who we've had on the call. I've seen councillors, traffic council officers, campaigners on the call. So these are all people with an interest in this. I should give some thanks to the Low Carbon Hub for providing our funding, particularly to our project manager Judy for herding the cats that are CoHSAT, keeping us organised through the year, to Legacy Events for helping us to organise and run the conference for today. And then if you can go to the next slide, we look forward to next year, and of course we don't plan to stand still. We're active by name and we're active by nature, and we know that Oxford has been awarded the status of one of the UK's three pilot zero emissions cities, which means it will be piloting and showcasing the way to a future that we know that all cities and towns must reach by 2050 with net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And we know some of what that entails. We know it means more active travel, and the shift is underway, we've talked about today. We know it means electric buses. Oxford has just won a 33 million grant that we match with 44 million from the bus companies and 6 million from the council. We know it will mean virtually no private cars or fossil fuel vehicles in the city centre. And that's going to be a subject of consultation later this year, exactly how that works. But what will it feel like to live there from day to day? We understand many of the pieces from projects that we've conducted or others have conducted, and some cities around Europe have parts of the answer. But we want to assemble a more complete view of the living experience, and we hope to work on that and bring that back to you this time next year. So until then, we'll ask for your feedback. Please tell us what you liked, what you didn't, and what you'd like us to study and campaign for over the coming year. And if your organisation would like to be part of this coalition, then drop us a line via the contact tab on the CoHSAT webpage. And in the meantime, enjoy walking, wheeling and cycling and the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.